No,
Is
it's not science fiction. They're like on one planet the entire time, pretty much. Like they're in the desert. It's a fantasy. It's like Lord of the Rings. It's a fantasy. Like there's not much like science in it. It's not like
Yeah,
2001.
that's the problem.
holy fuck, no. I mean, the books are science fiction. The movie is more fantasy.
I don't know. I listened to the book. The book was also very fantasy like.
Yeah, but you
it
listen to the
plays
book
more
and
like
you
Lord of the
couldn't
Rings.
answer the questions I was asking you. Those
All
are
I'm saying,
basic fucking questions.
It
They're not
plays
deep
more like Lord of the
lore or
Rings
anything.
than it does like say like a movie like a book like I'm trying to think of like a big science fiction book that I read, but there's not too many of them actually. I read more like short stories, but I mean there's like some of the Asimov like and like that stuff like is more science fiction. This is more fantasy.
What I'm not forget the movie. Forget the movie. What in your mind would qualify Foundation as science fiction and Dune not?
I think science fiction, much like Arthur C. Clarke too, like his movies, they're all about a potential future, a potential like almost science eventuality to some degree. Like 2001, like you see the details of like this is where we're going, as like that we're gonna have video calls and we're gonna like explore space and all these things. We're gonna have these fancy computers. Star Trek is science fiction because it is like it involves space, it involves technology. That's more science fiction than this, where it's a fantastical tale that just happens to be happening on multiple planets, but it's mostly on one sandy planet. So it's like 90% Lord of the Rings. Like it's like
what on earth you're saying like this and this, and then you're following it up with something that has nothing to do with what you just said.
No, but what I'm saying is that like there's nothing about Dune and Star Wars as well, for that matter, that is like about
Let's not talk
the
about Star
future.
Wars. Let's just talk about
I
Dune.
mean, Dune is supposed to be like some sort of like distant future of humanity.
Extremely distant. Yes.
But it's too far. It's too far.
What? What does that have to do with anything?
And it's too fantastical. When you look at like some of the books from like Asimov and like Bradbury and stuff, like the Martian Chronicles and things like that, it's like about like our solar system, interplanetary humanity.
So because it's you feel that because too much time has passed and because you're not seeing a close enough connection between our current world and the story, that disqualifies it from being science fiction?
Is that it leans too much. I mean, a lot of stories kind of hop like between science fiction and fantasy, like some of the genre parts of it. I just think that this has space in it, but it leans heavily on the fantasy aspect of it. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but
it just leans more. It's like 90-10 or 80-20.
Explain that part.
May I interject?
Please.
May I interject? Okay, Gil, specifically, when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy, would you draw a line between plausible, a future with plausible entities with which we may encounter as we Jesus, what's the right term? Plausibly, expand our reach in the universe, or and fantasy as something that kind of requires us to reach beyond what you would plausibly understand as something that we would encounter as we expand our reach. I mean, like if we develop warp drive, I mean, like we may encounter Klingons. or Romulans or something like that. I mean, I think that's where you're coming from, but we also may experience space worms. And
Yeah, I'm not. I didn't say the space worm is the thing that
mean,
makes it non-science fiction.
So what is?
Is the fact, for one thing, it's hard to believe that humans would even look the same that far into the future, especially like
Okay.
like
it's
intergalactic and everything. But then this is the reason why Star Trek is I think more Star Wars again. How George Lucas fixed Dune when he adapted it to Star Wars is a long time ago in a galaxy far away. Meaning like forget, this is not the future of humanity, it's somewhere else a long time ago, like, because that doesn't make we have no idea what humans would look like in thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, like especially like once we go intergalactic and like different gravities and all that stuff, like we're gonna evolve, we're gonna change, we're not gonna look the same. And also what's up with like it's an intergalactic society, but there's no alien races. Like it's only humans in the far future.
How is that less realistic?
I'm not saying it's less realistic. I'm just saying.
How is that less scientific?
I'm just saying that it's if you were to ask me, is Dune more like Lord of the Rings or 2001? What would you say? Would you say 2001? Really?
Yeah.
It's a space opera, just like Star Wars is.
It is not.
It's a space opera.
2001.
It's a melodrama. Dune is a melodrama. It's a space opera.
Wow.
I mean, that's what it is. It's like like intrigue and like like fantastical like creatures. Like that's stuff of fantasy. Like what's the space worm? It's a dragon. Like that's like it's the same concept. It's like the same idea, just done differently, like with a different like world building. But to me, 2001, Ex Machina is about AI and what that could bring. Like Moon is about cloning and like the nature of like your own conception of like of the self, and those are like
all I'm hearing.
Science-based stories.
I'm hearing that are making a point are basically saying that you feel more comfortable with stories that are more grounded in our current state of reality.
No, it's not. That doesn't have to. I like fantasy. I said I love Lord of the Rings. There's nothing wrong with fantasy. I'm just saying that Dune is more Lord of the Rings than it is 2001. It just is. I
completely disagree.
It just is. I mean, even if you compare 2001, the book to the Dune is a space opera, and 2001 is like it's very, very technology oriented, the future of humanity. Like it's very like a science eventuality to some degree. It just like maybe like was a little optimistic that by 2001 will go as far as they do in the book, but
let me ask a different question. What do you see in because in Lord of the Rings, I can see many things that I would have to just write off as fantasy. What do you see in Dune that you do not see as at least a possible science eventuality, given the concept of us expanding out into the stars and going off into many, many galaxies or many solar systems throughout the galaxy to the point where tens of thousands of years have passed and this civilization exists the way it's portrayed in the story?
I think what you would have to do.
I'm not talking about the movie. I'm talking about the book.
Yeah, I think generally what you would have to do, it would have to be more science-based. Like it would be more about how the technology affected humanity to some degree.
And if you read the book, then you should know that in the first chapter, the Bene Gesserit alludes to the fact that thousands of years before this book takes place, machines, or more precisely, people with AI took over, and machines took over a bunch of stuff in society, and then the humans eventually, after thousands of years, overthrew them, and now they have rejected technology because they don't want anything that resembles a human thinking patterns in a machine. So they have things like guns and lasers and spaceships, but they avoid any sort of computer or technological thing whenever they can, which is why you have them traveling through space using guild navigators, which are really freaky human beings who've been fucked up from Spice and can fold space rather than using technology to do it. And that's why you've got people like the Mentats, who are thinking computer humans who can do the stuff that computers can do with their own brains. But this movie doesn't cover any of that shit because this movie is fantasy. But the book explains all of that stuff in detail, which is why it's science fiction.
Yeah. No, I by the way, it is in the movie. I do recall they bring up the whole thing about the technology aspect, like about the history, like lightly, not as far as you go.
I don't think the movie talks about it at all.
And I'm not denying that like most scholars of like science fiction would consider this science fiction because it is in space. It is the future of humanity. I get that. But if I'm looking at it as a dummy, just like a lame person, if I'm looking at it like one next to the other, like, yes, it's got elements of science fiction. Like I said, it's not 100% fantasy, but it's like 80-20, 70-30. I'll even give you 60-40, but it is not 50-50. And it's not. I don't think it's 60-40 science fiction. I think it's more fantasy than science fiction. That's just like, and like I said, a lot of these like stories sometimes skirt both. I'm just saying that this is more space opera than high-minded science fiction, like a 2001, like Solaris, or like some of the Star Trek episodes, like things like that. That's just the way I see it. I'm not disagreeing that this is to some degree science fiction and that he put a lot of thought into it. It's just that it's got a lot of elements of fantasy in it.
As a major Star Trek fan, okay, what is more plausible in the physical universe? Giant space worms or dudes from alternate universes that can manipulate space and time? Because Dune is largely based around giant space worms. Star Trek, at least, at the beginning of the Next Generation, and with some of the best episodes that they had, are built around basically a godlike entity that can just, manipulate space as he sees fit. Which is more fantasy and which is more scientific? Which is more plausible in the physical world?
Again, like I said, like these stories have elements of both oftentimes, but I would argue that Star Trek has more science fiction than fantasy. It has elements of fantasy because obviously they come up with all these weird creatures that we have no idea if they could exist ever. But it's imagining that part, but it still is very science based, not just in the history of it, like with like the book and everything. It's like in every single episode, you see how technology affects people's lives and decision making, and and how humanity is like intermingled with that. Like here, it's basically like, okay, there's a lot of backstory, and I'll give it to you in the book, but then let's have a space opera. That's basically what it is. Like, it's a lot of setup, a lot of information, a lot of details, but it's ultimately, it's Lawrence of Arabia, it's Star Wars, it's Lord of the Rings. What it is not is 2001. It is not Moon. It is not Ex Machina. If you want like it is not, if you want a more action oriented, it is not Minority Report. Minority Report is like top to bottom, all about the technology. And what's like, moral, and what's, if we had this technology, how would humans react to it? This is not what this story is about. It's got some of it, but it's mostly a space opera. It's like I set up this complicated universe to like have a great fantasy story to tell. That's all. To be
I not only generous, but honest and sincere, and so on and so forth. I've made the same argument in regard to Star Trek versus Wars in terms of the separation between science fiction and fantasy, and that Star Trek is definitely more on the science fiction side. I believe that you're right when it comes to Ex Machina, when it comes to uh, Minority Report, and so on and so forth. That like these are things that we're dealing with. But here's the thing: when it comes to Ex Machina and Minority Report, this is science fiction that we're dealing with when it comes to technology that we're tampering with right now. Like, I mean, it's in our hands. Like, we're right on the precipice of this science fiction becoming real. And that's the importance of those movies, that we actually look at what could be major ethical questions within our lifetimes. I mean, like, I wouldn't be surprised if we, discover an algorithm in AI and, like, produce a robot or something like that who is going to be like, wow, I can't figure out whether or not this is a human being or an actual person, or a robot. So, what are the ethical values that I need to project onto this artificial intelligence? Is consciousness a real thing that we can measure? And that's also something that was brought up in Star Trek, obviously. But and with Minority Report, I mean, we're already clearly craving this idea that we can just find people guilty before they were even charged. So if we can have a technology that's plausibly operating in that space, we can see how that would be a sexy idea for a lot of people. And where I stand. But like, but I mean, this is all stuff that can happen in our lifetime. When you're talking about something like Dune or Star Trek, in regard to their sci-fi cred, or whether they're sci-fi or whether they're fantasy, I mean, what Star Trek is supposed? Well, I mean, the original Star Trek actually has a timeline that started like 20 years before we were 20 years prior. Oh, okay, yeah, Star Trek starts, a couple hundred years in the future. Dune starts 1,000 years in the future.
10,000.
10,000. I thought Dune started in the year 3000.
Nope. 10,100 and something, or something like that.
Okay. Well, I'm an idiot.
I actually don't have that information right in front of me, but looking at the appendices, it says that the emperor, or let's say Leto Atreides, was born in 10,140. I think the story there you go. So he died in 10,191. So that's when it takes place.
Right.
But
Yeah,
that's
but
actually,
I would say
it's actually more than that. It's actually more than that.
Like, let us like finish up. I will say, because that right there, like, it is a good point. It's a solid point. I think that one component of science fiction is that it's like a direct line from humanity. I just think that, like, he used that as like an in, but then told a very different story. Like the story wasn't enough about the way technology affects humans moment to moment. It affects them in the backstory and why this world came to be the way it is, but it doesn't deal with it the moment to moment. But that is a very good reason why this by many would be considered more science fiction than fantasy. I just think
Why do you think
like
it doesn't deal with it moment to moment?
Again, because like 2001 is about like humans venturing into space to meet aliens, right? Or a creator or somebody that like, brought them to where they were. And that's all it's dealing with. Here it's like there's a war and there's this and there's that. There's a space opera built around the universe that just so happens to be 10,000 years in the future. Which is like, it would be the same thing if Star Wars wasn't a long time ago in a galaxy far away. If Star Wars was the future of humans, that would also feel it would be more science fiction because it's a direct lineage like line, but it would still be a space opera. It would still be very fantasy like and not dealing with the consequences of it like moment to moment, like that the story is the technology. That's the thing in science fiction. The story, the plot, the story, everything is about the technology. And I get the technology exists in the story, but it's secondary to the space opera, to the drama. It's secondary. Where in science fiction, it's primary. It's all about the technology. That's what I'm saying.
Gil, I actually want to press you on this, and I'm probably going to come off as a dick for pressing you on this. But earlier on, you were talking about the humans in Dune and how they wouldn't look the same, and so on and so forth.
I mean, some of them look different, like the Harkonnens.
Right, yeah.
They don't really look that different.
No,
it was mostly like Lost.
Not in the books, anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but I mean, like, really, what is your standard here? I mean, obviously, if this is 10,000 years in the future, language would have changed. I mean, we probably would have changed a lot more than the Fremen and the Harkonnen and so on and so forth. We probably would have evolved in incredibly different ways in those 10,000 years. So if you're telling a story that takes place 10,000 years into the future, what's your standard for that being a sci-fi rather than a fantasy?
No, I mean, like I said, I already just said that like it's a fair argument that if it's a direct lineage to humanity and there's science involved, there's space involved, which is also an element of science fiction, that it is science fiction for the most part. It's just that the story itself plays more like fantasy than science fiction classically would tend to be. But yes, the point about the whole humans, I will suspend disbelief and say that like in 10,000 years, it's actually plausible, especially if we reject the technology, that it's plausible that there might not be major changes in the way humans would look. And that's fine. That's not what kills it for me as a science fiction. I'm just saying that like it's just the way it plays. That's all. And I'm not saying there's no room for a science fiction movie to be a big action oriented like drama. I just think that you always have to have the science like be a very, very integral part of the story of like what makes up like, to me, like, for example, Tenet is more science fiction than like Dune, because the whole movie is about the science of like I guess time travel or like traveling back. Like it's nothing but that. Inception is more science fiction than Dune. It's like you have a concept of science that is fictional because it doesn't really exist in the real world, and the entire movie is about that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good movie or a bad movie? That's a different story. But that's more science fiction than I'm setting up this complicated world that's in the future and it happens in space. but it basically plays like Lawrence of Arabia with a lot of funky, weird things. So you've made Lawrence of Arabia into Lord of the Rings, like a version of Lord of the Rings in space. That's basically what you did. Like it's not Inception. It's not Tenet. Those are more science fiction. They take a concept and they drill down on it. Even like Blade Runner, like you take a concept, like we have these robots that are android, and the whole movie is about that. Blade Runner has other issues that it's like about his like the themes and all that, but it's definitely all about the fact that there's these human-like robots and we got to deal with that technology. The whole movie is about that. Like that's the one thing you can't deny for Blade Runner. That is more science fiction than Dune. That's what I'm saying. Those people like Philip K. Dick, like Bradbury, Asimov, those are science fiction writers. I think Frank Herbert used the science fiction like like platter, but in order to tell a fantastical fantasy oriented story. That's what I think he did. That's what it comes off to me. Again, everybody has their opinions. I understand that because it's a direct lineage of humanity, it still could be considered science fiction, but it plays like fantasy. You know, that's I don't know why that's like so difficult to like. I mean, I'm not even saying it's binary. I'm saying it's on a spectrum, that it's got elements of it, but it's just it is what it is. That's the way. That's my reading of these stories, and that's just an opinion. Obviously, we can disagree.
So let me see if I'm reiterating this correctly to you. Okay. So you feel that something is more science fiction over fantasy if it's centered, if the story itself is centered around we're going to call it the technology, but or the science, but whatever the thing is that is different, the improbable or impossible thing that science or technology changed, and if the story is focused around that is more science fiction, rather than if it's something where it's just a world built around the technology and takes it to a future and so on and so forth.
Yeah, if anything, you would say that Dune is neither science fiction or fantasy. Like that it's not even science eventuality, that it's just a depiction of the future. It's a realistic, apparently, depiction of the future, because it is possible that there's like somewhere there's sandworms, then that will reach that kind of technology within 10,000 years. So it's neither science fiction or fantasy, because it's just the eventual potential for what humans can be. But it's really not about a concept. It's not about like a specific thing. Like I made a science fiction movie. It was about cloning, and the whole movie is about cloning. I made the feature film that I made was all about there's this drug you can give to kids and it can make them smarter, and that we don't have that drug in reality, but in the science fiction story it exists. But the whole movie is about that and nothing else. It's about that science fictional aspect of technology that is influencing the humans. Whereas in Dune, it's a very intricate thing set up, but then it's about warring parties. It's about like intergalactic intrigue. Like it's not, and I'll give it to you. I don't recall Foundation. I don't remember if I did listen to it back then, but that one might be also more fantasy than science fiction if it plays more into the politics of what humans would have like later on. It might be more like Dune then, but I do know that a lot of Asimov stuff, like especially the short stories, were very science fiction oriented. Like like I think his Bicentennial Man was like his.
Okay, so let me ask a question. If that's the metric that you're using to base something on, that specificity, taking the one thing that is science or technology, whatever, and because and I'm going to back this up by a definition as well, but using that as the only metric for what you're gauging as science fiction versus fantasy, then wouldn't a movie like, I don't know, the Splash be science fiction. I mean, it's a totally grounded, realistic movie about a guy who finds a mermaid and falls in love with her. There's nothing in that movie that's about politics. There's nothing in that movie about far off places. There's nothing in that movie about what's going on in his job or what happened to his ancestors or his descendants or anything like that, his enemies or anything. It's about a guy falling in love with a woman who happens to be a mermaid. Everything in the movie is about that one thing.
If he were to create her, like Frankenstein creates the monster, like that would be science fiction. But if she just appears from out of nowhere, that's fantasy. That's a creature.
The reason
that
I ask,
just,
I'm not gonna.
like we said, Q in Star Trek is the fantasy element of Star Trek.
I would also argue that most of the God stuff in DS9 is also. But I'm not going to pretend like I came up with this. I just Googled this real quick, and I actually kind of like this.
Argue to the contrary there. No. I think that Q and the prophets in Star Trek are within science fiction because of how they handled them.
Well, I think they are too.
They still handle them science, but it's just because they're fantastical.
Science fiction than because of how they handled them. I think they're less science fiction than what's in Dune. That's all I'm saying. But I just want to read.
Okay, you know, we're all.
I didn't come up with this, but this is just a quick Google search, and I actually really liked it, so that's why I wanted to read it. Science fiction explores what is possible, and then even if it's improbable, while fantasy explores the impossible. Now, I'm not saying that we have to agree with that. I'm just saying I kind of liked it when I read it. And if that's if that's a definition that anyone would want to go with, then all that means is that Dune is improbable, but the longer that the further out that the story exists in, the more probable that something like that could happen.
Yeah, but I disagree with that quote. I would definitely have an argument with that guy because it's not a bad quote. It's mostly correct, but there's also a lot of science fiction that would most likely never happen. I mean, you know, like
that's what the improbable part.
Well,
I mean, Back to the Future. Back to the Future technically is science fiction, even though it's an adventure movie, but it is science fiction because it's all about this invention that is created, and we're most likely are never going to invent time travel in the way that it at least is conceived in Back to the Future. So, you know, is Back to the Future fantasy? It's kind of more science fiction because it's about this technology that is fictional. That's why it's science fiction, not science eventuality. It's fictional, but like, what would happen if we had this technology? That's what science fiction is. What would happen if such and such existed, was possible? But technology. It can't be what if there are dragons, what if there are mermaids, because that's just fantasy. But like, what if, you know, the first science fiction story? What if a person reanimates a dead person? That's science. You know, setting up the story. Science that's like not possible.
What's wrong with you taking that exact concept you just said and then developing that into a bigger story? It sounds to me like you prefer science fiction when it's direct and focused. But what you're saying doesn't not apply to Dune. It's that when it gets to the Dune part, you feel that it's about too much.
No. Like I said, I don't like Blade Runner. I think Blade Runner lacks focus, but it still is very much a science fiction because it is still all about the fact that there's robots that look like humans, and that's an issue for the humans because they've run amok. So that is pure science fiction, even though I dislike the movie and I think it's not focused.
Pure about Dune.
I'm trying to think if Dune wanted to be science fiction, they need to come to a planet where humans have decided to have robots again. And then they would have a culture clash about why, or let's just say, what if the Fremen were descendants of humans, and then that the people from the outer world were people that evolved a different branch of humanity that decided to go a different route. And they're the ones that still have computers and robots and everything. And the Fremen are the ones that said oh no, that's bad news. that would be science fiction, because that would be dealing with like, how are these two sets of people different because of their divergence technologically? Like, one turned their backs on technology and the other ones decided. Here, all the humans turned their backs on technology, and there's
not
just
all
like,
of them, but the
and
ones in the story
he sets the tone, he sets the universe, just like Tolkien did in Lord of the Rings, and then he goes to town with a plot that excites him. Like, it's not about the technology. It's not about, like, Interstellar is about interstellar travel. Like, it's not about, it's interstellar travel, but there's a big war going on in space, and there's the bad guys and the good guys. No, that's Star Wars, but Interstellar is about the interstellar travel. That's science fiction.
But Gil, we already have travel in space. So if a movie were to take place on the International Space Station, how about Gravity? Is that science fiction?
What?
Just real quickly.
Is Gravity science fiction?
Is Gravity science fiction? I mean, it could be if we created a technology that changed gravity in some ways, and there was a story built around. Oh, the movie Gravity. Gravity, I think, isn't it like fairly realistic? Like Gravity?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so it's not really science fiction, but it's if there's anything there that's like not possible now, like, is Apollo 13 science fiction?
No, that's what I'm getting at. Your description of us going into space,
which is why I said Dune is neither
science
fiction or fantasy. If it's the eventual future of humanity, it's neither science fiction or fantasy.
What would make you think that Dune is the eventuality of science?
Because you said it's 10,000 in the future, and if it's not dealing with how technology affects humanity, like in the story, moment to moment, then it
is dealing with that.
No, it's imagining a potential future for humanity, but it's, in the way that I know science fiction, it's supposed to be all about a piece of technology and how it affects humanity.
This might not be terribly quickly, but okay. This is a story that I came up with a little bit ago. Like, all right. Humanity is dying, kind of like an interstellar thing. Just like Interstellar, we don't have warp drive or anything like that, so we send a massive, like, arc to an inhabitable planet, and after several generations, they finally reach this other planet, only to find that it's already inhabited by several million human beings, because during the time that they were in transit, the people on Earth discovered warp drive or hyperdrive or something like that, and we just started shuttling people over. And there's this whole thing going on, okay, right. So does that qualify as sci-fi to everybody? Just
I would
that.
say yes.
I think so. I don't know if I understood the whole thing, but it seems like, yeah, if it's based on the warp drive as enabling them to do something, yeah.
Okay, so would you say that All You Zombies by Robert Heinlein qualifies as sci-fi or fantasy?
What's the movie they made off that again? I can't remember.
It's the whatchamacallit, the Predestination.
Oh, right.
No, I mean that's definitely science fiction, because that's Back to the Future, like the same thing. Like, if you had time travel, that is a form of technology that the story is all about. So I feel like it is science fiction.
But on paradox, I mean, it's based off of a paradox. I mean, they even say it in the movie. Your existence is based off of a paradox. Paradoxes fundamentally not are fundamentally not scientific. I mean,
I don't know,
I
but
don't
there's
think that would
and Back to
disqualify it,
the
in my opinion.
and Back to the Future, there's paradoxes too. I mean, like, if you changed but that's why but that's why time travel movies are problematic, because of paradoxes.
Yeah, right.
No, but that's a
I guess-
different thing.
Sorry.
I know.
I'm glad that, like, I mean, like, I knew Jason was gonna be very hard-headed about this conversation. I'm glad that I got to be as well. So it's it
Me
evens
too.
things out.
Matt, were you still talking? Were you still trying to say something about that?
Yeah, I was
Continue, please.
basically just kind of saying, like, I mean, paradoxes are fundamentally not really scientific. They're logical. And so if you're and anything that's dealing with time travel, especially time travel into the past. Okay, like if you're talking about Interstellar, which is talking about time dilation, that's scientific. That's something that we can measure. That's something that we already know exists. But time traveling into the past is something that is just something that we're
fantasy.
playing.
That is a good point. That is a loophole. I would say that Back to the Future and Predestination might fall in the 50-50 category, where you can basically consider them both, because time travel has its own set of problems as a technology.
The only thing I wanted to harp on, and I get what Matt's saying there. Personally, I don't really see a problem with that. I do think that you're making an interesting point of focusing on what's scientific and what's not. But at the end of the day, all I was trying to get at is, I don't see why, if you had, forget about Dune for a second, okay? If you had a story that was about, what was some good ones we talked about? So, you like Moon because it's about cloning, right? If you had a story that you were trying to tell that involved cloning, and rather than it taking place when Moon takes place, it takes place, hundreds of years later, after this technology has changed things. And in your mind, you were like, oh my gosh, what would happen if we had cloning is this. And then you came up with this story about how that technology would actually change society. And then it wouldn't make sense to people. And they were like, well, that doesn't make sense because this is how our society is. And you said, no, it would make sense. You just haven't thought it out yet. And then you explained to them in detail, you see, the cloning allowed this to happen and then allowed this to happen. And as a result, that totally changed society on Earth. And then as you can see, they're already in space in that movie. We've started exploring other planets, and the cloning technology made labor really easy, and it helped us in our expansion and so on and so forth. And then the whole point was you were trying to tell an allegory. You were trying to tell something about life that we deal with today. But to you, the best way to tell that was to tell us this story in this cloning universe that took place like a good 500-600 years in the future, and a lot of stuff had changed. But to get to that point where you're telling that story, you felt the need to explain where we got from the story in Moon to where we got 500 years later. Why does that suddenly become not science fiction to you?
Well, you actually said one word that also sort of makes my point generally. I'm sure there's examples you can find in science fiction, but allegory. Fantasy is much more about allegory than science fiction is.
Not always.
For the most part, like Lord of the Rings was about World War II, I think, or at least World War One. And Star Wars is also similar thing. It was about Vietnam.
I'm not arguing about Star Wars.
No, but I'm just saying, like, fantasy tends to be allegory, and that's what is Dune. It's like a Messiah story, like it's the Jesus story.
Country is about the Cold War.
Yeah. So in any case, point is, like, exactly, like I said, there is there's science fiction. Yeah. There's science fiction, especially for the time. Yeah, they relate to the times to some degree, but but not in the same way that like fantasy. It's almost always like a big thing with big fantasy. It seems like, and that's why I'm saying, like, to me, Dune is more similar to the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars than it is the Undiscovered Country. Like, that's why some of the problem with the Star Trek movies is that they became fantasies instead of like and they have like the Star Trek 4 was like time travel. Like there's some time travel generally in Star Trek.
I just listed Star Trek 6, the most grounded one.
Yeah, so I mean, generally, Star Trek, like I said, has elements of fantasy in it, but ultimately, it is about technology. What would happen if we were like a spacefaring species? How would that affect us, and all that? How would that change our culture, and how would we interact with technology and with other creatures? But it is like very much a hybrid of science fiction and fantasy to some degree.
Okay,
it's not.
Let's go back. Go back to what I was saying.
It's not hard science fiction, like.
But still, what part of my example of taking a story that's that you love, that you claim is really good science fiction, and then if you just felt the need to tell a story that really would be best suited for that story, but in the future as you see it, and then you're willing to back up all the things that you say with scientific technological progression, why does that suddenly become fantasy to you?
Anyways, generally, I think this is very silly because nobody cares what's fantasy and what's science fiction. It's fun to debate
this all the time.
It's fun to debate this, but this could have been literally 1 minute of me just stating an opinion, and we could have just let it go. But fine, like let's finish it. If that future story that involved cloning was about the cloning. Like there's something about cloning. There's a character and he's being cloned, but he wasn't told that he's cloned, and that affects like his if it's all about cloning, yes. But if the cloning is as important as cloning is in Attack of the Clones, then that's fantasy. That's not science fiction because it's not about the cloning. It's not about the technology that built the entire world. That's ultimately what it is. Like Attack of the Clones is not about cloning. It's a part of a very large saga space opera that's kind of more plays like fantasy, but it's got spaceships and space in it. But that's just like it's not like binary, and it's not like, and I'm sure many will disagree with me. I'm just stating an opinion that Dune is more like Lord of the Rings than it is like Moon or 2001. I think that you would at least agree with that aspect of it.
I don't. I think that it sounds like
it's because you're obsessed with the book.
No, I think your logic does not make sense. It sounds like someone arguing like this, going, you know what? Moon is science fiction because it's about one thing. It's about cloning. And then the other person going, no, wait, listen, wait. And then the other person going, no, it is science fiction. It is, but Star Trek is science fiction too. And then the first person goes, nah, Star Trek isn't science fiction. You know why? Because Star Trek doesn't have one thing in it. It has transporters, it has warp drive, it has cloaking, it has phasers, it has all this stuff. It's not focused on one single thing.
More importantly, Star Trek has Q.
We're not getting into that.
Which I already said. I've already conceded that Star Trek is a combination of the two. That's fine.
I'm not talking
but
about
for example, 2001 is about AI. It's about the prospects of meeting aliens. It's about how intelligence comes to be. Whether it's like random or was affected by something in the universe. Like it's about several things, but it's all about those things. And they're all related to science to some degree. For the most
part. How do you not see that all the things that Dune is about and covers and addresses are all related to science and society?
Dune is not about the science. Dune is an allegory for a Messiah story. Like it's Jesus in space.
What does that have to do with anything?
Every sci-fi story, great sci-fi story has that kind of an element to it.
No, give me one. Give me one that's like Dune. Give me one.
Basically,
Give me
every
one
Star
science fiction that's like Dune. Give me another example.
Well,
Uh,
most people would say the Foundation is a lot like Dune.
And I've already conceded that there's a possibility the Foundation might be more fantasy than science
but
fiction.
only by your definitions.
Exactly, but I gave you my definition, and as long as
I'm rejecting your definition because it's not logical.
It's logical to me because the way I look at it, these things are not binary; they're on a spectrum, and I feel like Dune plays more like fantasy than science fiction, based on the many science fiction movies and books and short stories that I've
but
read.
all of the reasons that you are praising the stuff that you say is science fiction is because it's focused around one thing.
It's not. I just gave you the 2001 example. It's not about the one thing. It's about technology in general.
Yeah,
yes,
but what part of Dune is not about technology in general?
It's not. It's about a Messiah story. That's not technology. It's not about the technology. It's about a Messiah.
That's like saying that Minority Report is about being proven guilty.
It's as if Minority Report would have the technology, the technology of like like seeing the future and all that, but the actual plot was like a love story between Tom Cruise and his wife.
No,
but it's not about the
not
technology.
like that at all.
It would be like just this is part of the universe, and this is how Tom Cruise became to have the personality that he does. But now we're gonna tell a different story, and this is gonna be in the background. That's essentially what Dune is.
That is definitely not accurate.
Like there's a lot of backstory that this is how humans came to be the way this is, and now we're gonna tell a Messiah story and an allegory to blah blah blah. Like that's. I don't know why this is so like, but it's fine. I get it. Arguments sometimes nobody likes to concede in an argument, especially.
It's not about that. It's you're not connecting.
Based on the definition that I gave you, it's amazing to me that you don't want to concede that Dune is more like Lord of the Rings than 2001. Like if
because
you put
Lord of the Rings,
those three movies,
magic.
People,
Lord of the Rings is about the impossible. To use that other less than perfect definition.
Whereas 3 movies to 100 people and I told them forget definitions, which 2 movies are more alike? Dune, Lord of the Rings?
Because Lord of the Rings is an epic world.
You can see it.
No, I did not. I said it's an epic world, whereas the 2001 is a very focused story. That's everything you've been saying this whole time, is that you like stories that are focused around one simple concept. You don't like well-developed built worlds.
No, it's about.
Well, or you don't. It's not that you don't like them, but you just consider them fantasy because of that.
Yeah, to some degree, it's on a spectrum, but yes, they just play that way because it's not about the technology. That's all. That's just my definition. I'm not saying I'm right. Look, Foundation. Foundation, it says on Wikipedia, is an American science fiction television series. They define it as science fiction, but it could be the premise is it says 1,000-year saga, banned exiles will discover that the only way to save the Galactic Empire from destruction is to defy it. That might play as more fantasy than science fiction to me, to my definition. But who am I? I'm nobody. I'm just giving my opinion based on is the fact that I would say that Inception is more science fiction than Dune. I'm sure most people will disagree with me, but I'm allowed to have that opinion, and I've made my argument. And
of course, you're allowed to have the opinion.
Yeah.
I just think that it's inconsistent.
How is it inconsistent? I gave you multiple examples.
Because I said all of your examples that you say are science fiction, like real science fiction, happen to be examples that are very focused around one single element. Whereas anytime it's something like Foundation or something like Dune or something that is not necessarily science fiction like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, you're not saying that they're bad movies, but to you suddenly that becomes not science fiction, and not because they don't deal with technology, not because but because they're not focused on one single thing. Instead, it's a well-developed, built world around a very realistic concept, or in fantasy like Lord of the Rings, a very fanciful, fantastical kind of world with some interesting rules that are based on magic. But you're not saying like it has to be based on magic or it has to be based on technology. Instead, you're saying the moment it's not about one single thing, I just feel like it's fantasy. And that's okay if that's how you feel. I just think that's not a very good way to go
because
about
when I look at it as objectively as possible, to me, Dune plays more like Star Wars, I mean, more like Lord of the Rings than some of this my favorite science fiction. And it's not to say that there's no science fiction that's like big movies with a lot of action. That's not it. I said like, Edge of Tomorrow is science fiction. Like Minority Report is science fiction. In any case, there's a definition here. Like it says, usual science fiction. What defines it? Usually futuristic science fiction speculates about alternative ways of life made possible by technological change. That's Dune, that to some degree, right?
Yes,
and
very
hence
much.
has sometimes been called speculation fiction, like fantasy, and often associated with it, science fiction envision alternative worlds with believably consistent rules and structures, blah, blah, blah. So yes, that is Dune to some degree, but it also says, like fantasy, and often associated with it, meaning that science fiction and fantasy tend to be on this spectrum. But my takeaway from science fiction, for the most part, is that it's about, like, again, going back to Frankenstein, like the movie is about the thing that the fiction is. Like it's less about like, let's set up a fantastical universe that's scientific and maybe futuristic, and now just tell a completely different story. Let's make it a comedy. Let's make it a fantasy. Let's make it a tragedy. Let's make it a horror movie. Like that's why you might complain about Sunrise. That Sunrise is not really science fiction. It's a horror movie. It especially turns into horror movie in the last part.
Sunshine?
Sorry? Sunshine?
You mean Sunshine?
Sunshine, yeah.
Yeah, the Danny Boyle
The Danny Boyle movie. Yeah. I mean, that one it starts as a science fiction, but it essentially devolves into like Event Horizon of sorts. Like it becomes a horror movie, and it doesn't really deal with the science that much. But that's fine. They have every right to do that. I just watched that movie and I'm like, okay, I thought I'm here to watch a science fiction movie, but I don't feel like I am. Whereas I watch a movie like Moon, and it's in space. It's I don't know if it's science fiction yet. Might be like Apollo 13, to some degree. I don't know what the story that they're telling. But then when I realized that he's a clone and that like he has an identity crisis and all that, is like, oh my God, that's the purest form of science fiction. And also it comes with a twist, like as opposed to Ex Machina, that's from start to finish is pure science fiction. But I mean, that's just the way I look at it. But then I watch a movie like Dune and I'm like, it's it's like Lawrence of Arabia in space / Lord of the Rings. Like that's just, and those things are fantastical. They're like take you to faraway places like Arabia or like Middle Earth. Like that's Dune, this like fantastical planet. But it's not about like about technology per se. There's technology involved. Obviously, you got to build the world. You can't just like start telling a story in a completely different world and not set it up to some degree, especially in a book. But just the way that it plays, it's not about the, like I said, I about 30 minutes ago I said like Dune could have been more about the technology if it was like had competing humans, some like had the technology and some didn't, and then the movie was all about why that technology like has disadvantages and advantages, and like like what's the contrast between these races and whatnot. It's not like everybody had on the same track and then they're going to play out this space opera. That's two very different movies. One I would consider more science fiction than the other because it deals with the technology head on, with the change in technology.
I get what you're saying. To me, it sounds like you're really focusing on like for instance, you remember when you said comparing 2001 and Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, obviously, there's all sorts of stuff that's similar about Lord of the Rings and Dune because they're both big, giant, like intricately built worlds, right? And they're both sagas and stuff like that. But to grasp onto that as the defining difference between them, to me is like comparing movies and saying like, okay, let's look at some romantic comedies, and you're like, what is more similar? If we were to take the that Jude Law, Kate Winslet movie, The Holiday, and compare it to Love Actually, which is another romantic comedy, or is it more like Straw Dogs? And it's like, well, you know what? Straw Dogs and The Holiday both take place in small British villages. And so aesthetically, they are much more alike than a big ensemble, anthology type of movie like Love Actually. So realistically, those two are more similar. But you couldn't be more wrong. I mean, the Straw Dogs is nothing like this. No romantic comedy element in that movie at all. It bears a lot of similarities to the other movie because they're both set in the same exact kind of place.
Yeah, I mean there's a few definitions here from the masters, which are interesting. It says according to Isaac Asimov, science fiction can be defined as the branch of literature that deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. Robert Heinlein wrote that a handy short definition of almost all science fiction might read: realistic speculation about possible future events based solidly on adequate knowledge of the real world, past and present, and on a thorough understanding of the nature and significance of the scientific method. Then American science fiction author and editor Lester Del Rey wrote, even the devoted aficionado or fan has a hard time trying to explain what science fiction is, and the lack of a full satisfactory definition is because there are no easily delineated limits to science fiction. So again, I'll concede again, and I've said from the beginning that Dune has science fiction elements to it. It's a spectrum. And I think that's like what they're saying is that it's a spectrum. It's hard to define. Dune could be 20, 30, 40, and maybe to some people 60, 70% science fiction and only 30% fantasy. It's just, to me, the spectrum just falls a little differently based on my interpretations of these stories, and how
you said the second one again. I liked the second one a lot.
Oh, the Heinlein,
that was Heinlein.
All science fiction might read realistic speculation about the possible future events based on solidly on adequate knowledge of the real world, past and present, and on a thorough understanding of the nature and significance of the scientific method. Yeah, I mean, because that
one's pretty good. I like that one.
Because but that's, I don't know. It's a little bit too rigid because Frankenstein.
No, it is. It is rigid.
Like sure. Frankenstein is like to reanimate a person. I mean, I'm not sure if we're ever gonna do that. I mean, maybe, but. But that is the definition of science fiction, to say what if we had the technology to reanimate a person? Like, what would that do to the creator of this person? What would it do to the person? Like, that's like, to me, if you want a definition of science fiction, that's like Frankenstein kind of started.
Well, I don't think anybody would argue that Frankenstein is science fiction.
Yeah. So that's.
Well, never mind. There's people who would argue it, but I don't.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of examples. Like, I'm sure there's big books with very involved, like Dune and for example, Ender's Game. I mean, that's
another
science
movie
fiction.
that was horribly adapted.
Yeah, but that's like science fiction for the most part because it's about the technology of what these kids are doing. And the twist that they don't realize that it's not really a game, that it's the actual war and all that. I mean, that to me has more of an element of science fiction. It'll be more on the spectrum of that. But so it's not necessarily, Heinlein is a bit too rigid to say that it needs to be realistic scientifically, understanding of science.
The last part is where he kind of loses me.
Because it could be fantastical within reason. You can't just sprout like a mermaid, like we said. But I think if it's a plausible technology that could potentially exist and see how we're gonna react to it, that's a lot of Twilight Zone 2 is considered science fiction, but it's really some of it is more fantasy, some of the episodes than others. So it's
the gremlin on the wing of the plane with William Shatner.
it's all just it's all fine. I honestly like I'll concede that like Dune definitely could be very close even to 50-50 on the science fiction because it is heavy on the setup and it's just that the story that he actually tells just it just doesn't seem like it's about the what's the like Battlestar Galactica I think is another good example that's also similar to some degree because it's like
some degree
because like humanity like there was like an issue there where like they're fighting against the robots because like they realize that like robots are a bad thing and that they're so that is very science fiction because it's all about how they deal with the constant but you see like it's not in the past like you're in like Dune would actually if he said it 5,000 years in the past during the wars that they can do a prequel for Dune like during the wars against the AI and the robots that would be more science fiction than the Dune movie itself. That's
I get what you're saying. I'm not sure if I'd agree. I have read the books that his son wrote based on his notes for the prehistory where all that stuff takes place. I thoroughly enjoyed them, but I, like most people who've read the books, agree that there's probably some liberties taken. They're probably not quite exactly how his dad would have portrayed everything, and they're a little questionable. But boy, are they kind of fun to read. But they're definitely not as well written or as good as the 7 books that he wrote.
And it gets like I guess last thing I would say it gets a little weirder too. Like for example, like H.G. Wells is a famous science fiction writer, but a lot of his like books kind of read like fantasy because like The Martian's like, coming, and
oh yeah.
There's like the time machine, the time machine thing. It's like it definitely like they kind of bounce back and forth fantasy and science fiction, but to me like some feel more science fiction, some feel more fantasy, but but they both have a lot of them have elements of both. Surprisingly, sci-fi and horror also are very connected, which I never understood. I guess that's the whole Event Horizon and Sunshine.
Oh, I love Event Horizon.
Yeah, should do an episode.
Future episode, maybe.
Should do a double feature: Sunshine and Event Horizon.